Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, Miss Marple faces a dark puzzle during Lent. Secrets hide in quiet corners, waiting to be uncovered. Pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. Where are you listening from tonight? It was the sort of evening that belonged to a village painted in muted shades, quiet cottages, smoke rising thinly from chimneys, and the echo of church bells lingering after the Ash Wednesday service. Lent had begun in St. Mary, Mead, and with it came the usual talk of restraint and repentance. But alongside those pious conversations, something far darker was already stirring. The hush of devotion broke when the church doors opened and the congregation spilled into the cool night. Candles were extinguished, coats drawn tight. On the stone steps, a few parishioners lingered to gossip in lowered voices. "Strange, isn't it, how Mr. Linton kept glancing over his shoulder during the service," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley. "Strange indeed," another replied. "And he left before the final hymn. Almost ran out, if you ask me." Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her cane, said nothing. Her eyes followed the disappearing figure of Mr. Linton, coat collar pulled high, walking briskly toward the green. She did not comment. She rarely did at first, but she noted the flush on his face, the restless hands tugging at his gloves. By the time the crowd dispersed, the village had resumed its familiar rhythm, yet even then, unease seemed to cling like mist. The next morning, unease turned to alarm. At the break of day, a scream pierced the quiet. It came from the churchyard, where Mrs. Copley had gone to tend the flowers. Villagers rushed to the scene, Miss Marple among them. There, beside the lych gate, lay the crumpled body of Mr. Linton. His prayer book, curiously, was clasped tight in one hand. The other hand was smeared with a dark streak that was not soil, though it might have been mistaken for it in the first frantic moments. "He's dead," Mrs. Copley wailed. "Murdered in the Lord's own season of penance." Constable Reeves tried to hush the crowd, but whispers grew like ivy on stone. Murder? Surely not here in St. Mary, Mead. Wasn't he the one always travelling to London on odd errands? Miss Marple bent closer, peering at the fallen man with her calm, bird-like gaze. She noticed something odd. A sprig of ash leaves tucked awkwardly beneath the collar of his coat. Ash on Ash Wednesday. That, she thought, was no accident. She did not speak yet, but she held the detail in her mind as firmly as a needle threaded with the finest cotton. Around her, suspicion sprouted in eager tones. He had enemies, mark my words. Or debts to someone in London, perhaps. No, it was something local. "Don't you remember the quarrel over the church fund?" Miss Marple straightened, folding her hands gently over her cane. She looked from one villager to another, quietly watching, quietly measuring. Human nature, she reflected, was never far from the surface, especially when fear was involved, and already she had seen more than one pair of eyes shift too quickly away from the dead man's body. "Stay with us until the end. Only then will the truth be revealed." By mid-morning, the news of Mr. Linton's sudden death had spread across St. Mary, Mead like fire catching on dry straw. The grocer's boy announced it with relish at every door he stopped at, while the women at the bakery whispered in breathless tones over their bread orders. It seemed impossible that such violence had visited their quiet parish on the very first day of Lent. The vicarage, standing modestly behind the church, soon became a place of hurried meetings and low, anxious voices. The Reverend Leonard Clement had been fetched at once, and he did his best to soothe the agitated villagers who had come seeking answers. "Now, please," he said firmly, raising a hand to calm them, "let us remember Mr. Linton in our prayers before we leap to conclusions. The authorities will look into this. Until then, restraint is our duty." His wife, Griselda, far less restrained, muttered under her breath as she poured tea for the guests. Restraint, when half the village is quivering with curiosity. It's a wonder they aren't combing the hedgerows for a weapon already. She pressed a cup into Miss Marple's hands with a sigh. "At least you'll keep your head, Jane. Heaven knows the rest of them won't." Miss Marple thanked her softly, but her eyes were not on the tea. They were on Mrs. Copley, who had found the body. The poor woman sat pale and trembling, her hands twisting the lace edge of her handkerchief. "I only went to put fresh flowers by the lich gate," Mrs. Copley said, her voice wavering, and there he was, as though he had fallen straight from the sky. "But I know what I saw, Miss Marple. I know what I saw, and what was that, dear?" Miss Marple's voice was kind and coaxing. Mrs. Copley leaned closer. "There was someone else in the churchyard last night, after the service. I saw a shadow moving among the gravestones as I left. I thought it was just the wind stirring the yew branches, but now I'm not so certain." The room shifted uneasily at her words. Reverend Clement frowned, clearly wishing such details had not been shared aloud. Griselda, however, seized on it at once. "Well, that's it then. Someone was lurking about. It couldn't have been anyone from here. More likely some outsider, a vagrant perhaps. Or," interjected Colonel Melchett, who had come at the constable's request, "someone with reason enough to hide. Not all crimes come from strangers. Mrs. Clement, often the most dangerous quarrels are close to home." His tone carried weight, though his eyes flicked about the room as if measuring the reactions of each listener. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. She knew better than to press just now, but her mind tucked away Mrs. Copley's trembling certainty about the shadow. One clue, perhaps, or perhaps the fragile invention of a frightened woman. The conversation shifted, as gossip often does, to Mr. Linton's affairs. "I never trusted him," Mrs. Price Ridley declared from her corner chair. "Always off to London, but never saying why. And did you see the way he dressed? Quite above his means, if you ask me." "Indeed," muttered Colonel Melchett. "There are already whispers he had debts. If so, someone may have wished to collect in a most final fashion." At this, Miss Marple's sharp gaze rested quietly on the Colonel. The remark was too quick, too ready, as if he had considered it long before voicing it. Just then, Constable Reeves arrived to report to the vicar. "No sign of a weapon yet, sir. We've searched the churchyard. And well, there's something peculiar. The marks by the lich gate don't look like a struggle. More like he was placed there." Placed there. The phrase rippled through the gathering like a stone dropped into still water. "Then where did he die?" asked Griselda in a hushed voice. Constable Reeves shook his head. "We can't yet say." Miss Marple looked down at her folded hands. Her needlework years had taught her that threads rarely lie where they first appear, and so it seemed with poor Mr. Linton. "Have you guessed yet who is lying?" The narrator might whisper to those listening, but Miss Marple herself said nothing aloud. Instead, she allowed her gaze to travel once more around the room. Mrs. Copley was still twisting her handkerchief. Colonel Melchett tapped the arm of his chair, too briskly for calm. Griselda's eyes glittered with curiosity rather than fear, and the Reverend, trying but failing to mask a shadow of unease. At that moment, the church bell rang at noon, startling everyone. Mrs. Copley gave a cry, her cup slipping and shattering on the floor. All heads turned, and Miss Marple quietly noticed that one person, just one, had not reacted at all to the sudden clang. A telling stillness in a room full of startled movement. It was, in her experience, such small things that betrayed the truth. The bell of St. Mary Mead had scarcely finished echoing before the villagers' natural instinct took over speculation. And where better for speculation than Mrs. Turner's tea shop, with its polished counters, steaming pots, and tables set neatly for the day's early visitors. By noon, it was already buzzing. Miss Marple, who preferred her tea brewed with patience rather than gossip, nevertheless took her seat at the small table by the window. She understood quite well that to listen was often more rewarding than to ask. I tell you, it's London that will explain it, Mrs. Hartnell said briskly, spoon-tapping her cup. Always going there, always returning late at night. It was bound to lead to trouble. Rubbish, Mrs. Price Ridley countered sharply. It's money, not London, that did it. He was in debt, mark my words. Look at the way he wore that fine overcoat, and his boots are far too expensive for a clerk's salary. Mrs. Turner herself, bustling with the teapot, leaned in. But did you hear what Mrs. Copley said at the vicarage? A shadow in the graveyard. Imagine a murderer skulking among the stones while we sang the final hymn. A shiver rippled through the little group. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Curious, is it not, she murmured gently, that Mr. Linton carried his prayer book so tightly in his hand. Most people let them fall open or put them in their pockets. To hold on so firmly, why? It might almost suggest he wished to protect it. Her words slipped into the stream of gossip like a stone into a brook, barely noticed but subtly altering the current. Mrs. Hartnell frowned. Protect it? From what? Miss Marple only smiled, folding her hands around the warm teacup. At the far table, Mr. Pritchard, the retired schoolmaster, cleared his throat. If you ask me, the matter is simpler than all your tales. He was quarrelling with someone here in the village. I saw him speaking rather heatedly with Colonel Melchett last week near the post office. Colonel Melchett? Mrs. Price. Ridley's eyebrows shot up, but he's helping with the inquiry. Which makes it all the more remarkable, Mr. Pritchard said, lowering his voice. They were arguing about the church fund, something about misused contributions. Miss Marple raised her eyes, calm but watchful, another thread to add to her quiet collection. Mrs. Turner leaned closer to Miss Marple. And what do you think, Jane? You've always had a knack for noticing things the rest of us overlook. Oh, I think nothing, Miss Marple replied with a modest smile. Except that people rarely quarrel over what they appear to quarrel about. Money may be the subject, but pride, resentment, or some small slight usually lies beneath. The conversation swirled on. Bits of memory, half-formed suspicions, and more than one invention were offered eagerly. And in the midst of it, Miss Marple saw the door open. In came Mr. Linton's housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, face pale, hands fluttering as she clutched her bag. The tea shop fell silent at once. Every eye followed her as she moved to the counter. "I've come for tea leaves," she said quickly, though her voice wavered. "I've nothing in the house." "Poor dear," Mrs. Turner said kindly. "You must be shaken." But Mrs. Briggs seemed anxious to be gone. She fumbled coins, knocked over a spoon, and nearly left without her change. And just before she turned to leave, her gaze darted across the room to Miss Marple, who was watching her with gentle interest. The housekeeper flushed, then hurried out. "Well," exclaimed Mrs. Price Ridley, "if that isn't guilt written plain as day, running about like a hen caught in the garden. She knows more than she lets on." "Or less than she thinks she does," Miss Marple said softly. But no one heard her above the renewed chatter. When the voices grew too loud, Miss Marple took her leave. She walked slowly along the lane, her mind as busy as her knitting fingers. One clue sat neatly with the others. Now the tightly gripped prayer book, the shadow among the stones, Colonel Melchett's quick talk of debts, and now the housekeeper's frightened glance. As she reached her garden gate, she paused, for across the green she saw Constable Reeves. He was speaking hurriedly with another villager, gesturing toward the churchyard. Miss Marple could not hear the words, but she caught the constable's expression, a mix of puzzlement and unease. Something new had been found, and she knew at once it would not ease the villagers' gossip, but inflame it further. Miss Marple had just set down her hat and removed her gloves when the bell at her garden gate rattled. Constable Reeves stood there, shifting his weight uncomfortably, his cap in hand. He looked as though he had swallowed something disagreeable and had yet to find the courage to admit it. "Good afternoon." Constable Miss Marple greeted him in her gentle voice. "I thought you were busy at the churchyard." "I was, ma'am," he replied, glancing down the lane as if to make certain no one else could overhear. "But there's something peculiar. We found a glove. Men's glove. Fine leather, though worn at the fingertips, lying half hidden under the hedge by the vestry wall." Miss Marple inclined her head, her blue eyes watchful. "And whose glove might it be, do you suppose?" "That's just it," Reeves said. "No initials inside, no name, but the size. Broad hand, large fingers. Not many men here fit it, and the vicar swears it doesn't belong to him." "Gloves," Miss Marple murmured, "are funny things. They're meant to protect, yet so often betray. Who wore them last, I wonder, and why leave one behind?" Reeves cleared his throat. "Colonel Melchett was there when I picked it up. He said at once it couldn't be his. A bit too hasty, if you ask me. Still, I thought you ought to know. You have a way of seeing what others don't." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "That is very obliging of you, Constable. It will be most interesting to see who attempts to claim or to deny that glove." When Reeves departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while with her knitting, her needles clicking softly. A glove, a prayer book, a shadow in the graveyard. Threads, each one, waiting to be woven together. But there was also the matter of Mrs. Briggs, Mr. Linton's housekeeper, whose hurried departure from the tea-shop lingered in her mind. That very afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call at Mr. Linton's cottage. It stood at the end of a narrow lane, small but tidy, with a trim hedge and a little gate that creaked on its hinges. Curtains were drawn, though the lamps were unlit, and the air around the house seemed heavy, as if it resented intrusion. Mrs. Briggs answered the door at once, her face pale, her eyes red as though from weeping. She clutched her apron as if it were a shield. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said in a trembling voice, "I'm not fit to receive visitors." "Nonsense," Miss Marple replied kindly. "A little company may do you good, and besides, I think a pot of tea would help us both." Reluctantly, the housekeeper let her in. The sitting room was neat but bore signs of recent agitation. A chair slightly out of place, a drawer half shut, and a faint smell of dust stirred by hasty movements. They sat together, and Mrs. Briggs busied herself with the teapot, her hands shaking as she poured. Miss Marple watched her with quiet eyes, waiting for the woman to speak. "It's dreadful," Mrs. Briggs burst out at last. "Him lying there like that. On holy ground, no less. I served Mr. Linton faithfully for 10 years. He was a kind enough man, though he had his secrets." "Secrets," Miss Marple repeated softly. Mrs. Briggs pressed her lips together, as though regretting her words. "I shouldn't say. But you see, he had letters. He kept them locked in the drawer of his desk. Always careful about them, he was. Sometimes he'd sit reading them late into the night, with the blinds drawn tight. And last week, well, I found the drawer unlocked. By accident, of course. And one letter was missing the next day." Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. "A missing letter? And you don't know what it contained?" Mrs. Briggs shook her head. "I didn't dare read them. But they were written on fine, expensive paper. And I recognized a woman's hand. Whoever she was, she mattered to him." "A woman's hand," Miss Marple mused. "That does complicate things." The housekeeper twisted her apron again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I think someone must have known about those letters. Someone who feared they'd come to light. And now Mr. Linton's dead." There was a long silence in the small sitting room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple placed her teacup gently on the saucer. "My dear, you are very brave to speak of this. But tell me, when you left the tea shop this morning, why did you look so frightened?" Mrs. Briggs flushed. "I saw Colonel Melchett on the street. He was staring at me, as though he knew I'd said too much already. I hurried away because I didn't want to be questioned in front of half the village. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The Colonel again. His name kept returning to her ears like a refrain. Too often, too quickly. When she left the cottage, the late afternoon sun was already slanting across the village green. Children played, oblivious to the dark talk of murder, while the adults stood in little knots, whispering and speculating. Miss Marple walked home at her measured pace, her mind busy with what she had learned. The missing letter was no small matter. Letters were powerful things, especially when they carried the weight of secrets. And in her long experience, Miss Marple knew that secrets bound people together in ways they rarely admitted. They could destroy reputations, or worse, lives. As she neared her gate, as she paused, across the lane, she saw Colonel Melchett himself standing outside the inn, speaking with another man in low tones. He held his hat in his hand, gesturing sharply, and when he noticed Miss Marple watching, he gave her a curt nod before turning away. She lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Then she entered her garden, thinking of the glove, the letters, the housekeeper's fear, and the Colonel's too ready answers. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the village settled into its night, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and considered the tangle of threads before her. Each new piece seemed to complicate the pattern rather than clarify it, yet she knew well that the truth lay hidden among these very complications. She set down her work at the sound of hurried footsteps on the lane. A knock came at her door, sharp and urgent. It was Constable Reeves once again, breathless from his haste. "Another discovery, Miss Marple," he said, his face pale. "The desk at Mr. Linton's is broken open, and every letter inside is gone." Miss Marple folded her hands together, her expression calm but her eyes bright with understanding. "Then, Constable, it seems someone is very determined to keep Mr. Linton's secrets buried with him." The constable swallowed, glancing over his shoulder into the night. "And if they went to such lengths once, who's to say they'll stop there?" Miss Marple rose, her voice steady. "Quite so. And that, I fear, is the most dangerous part." The news of the broken desk and the vanished letters spread with a swiftness that rivaled the church bell itself. By the next morning, every villager with ears to listen or lips to speak had woven the detail into their own narrative of Mr. Linton's death. Some said the letters contained proof of scandal, others insisted they were evidence of debts or even blackmail. Few admitted they knew nothing at all. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had not contributed to these wild conjectures. Instead, she attended quietly to her garden in the early morning, trimming a stubborn rose bush and thinking carefully about what she had heard. The theft of the letters was not simply an afterthought. It was, in its own way, a continuation of the crime. Whoever killed Mr. Linton wanted his secrets buried as deeply as his body would soon be. By mid-morning, Constable Reeves called again, this time looking both proud and worried. "I've been to the cottage," he announced as he stood at her gate. "There's no doubt the desk was forced. Splinters of wood on the carpet. Whoever did it wasn't neat about it. And the Reverend Clement says he passed the lane last night around 10:30. He swears there was a lamp still burning in the sitting room." Miss Marple tilted her head. 10:30? And what time was Mr. Linton last seen alive? Reeves shifted uneasily. "Some say he left the Ash Wednesday service before the last hymn. That would have been nearer 8 o'clock. Miss Marple murmured. So there were 2 hours unaccounted for, and a lamp still burning later. Either Mr. Linton was meeting someone in secret, or someone else was in the house after his death. The constable nodded gravely. That's what I feared. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a call to the vicarage once again. Griselda greeted her at the door, brimming with the excitement of new gossip. You've heard, of course. Letters gone. And they say it must be a woman at the heart of it. I never doubted it. A man doesn't lock away letters like treasure unless there's a lady involved. And a lady means jealousy. And jealousy, she leaned closer with dramatic relish. Jealousy means murder. Reverend Clement appeared behind his wife, frowning heavily. Griselda, please. We mustn't indulge in scandalous chatter. But even he could not disguise the strain in his voice. His eyes darted toward Miss Marple, as if half expecting her to weigh in with wisdom. I dare say, Miss Marple said gently, that human nature is the same in St. Mary Mead as it is anywhere else. Letters can cause quite as much trouble as blunt instruments, sometimes more, and I should not be surprised if they proved central to this unhappy affair. The Reverend sighed deeply. It's a matter for Colonel Melchett now. He insists on keeping the inquiry close at hand. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And yet, it seems the Colonel himself has been mentioned in connection with Mr. Linton, has he not? Griselda's lips curved into a knowing smile, but her husband cleared his throat sternly and changed the subject. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk toward the village green. The tea shop was brimming with eager voices, but she passed it by. Instead, she turned down the lane leading to Mr. Linton's cottage. Outside, she found Mrs. Briggs bent over the flower bed, her apron dusted with soil. "Oh, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, straightening hastily. "I thought I'd best tidy the garden. It looks so neglected with the master gone." "Very thoughtful of you," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Though I wonder, have you seen anyone near the cottage since last evening?" Mrs. Briggs hesitated, eyes flickering. "I heard footsteps after dark, heavy footsteps. They stopped outside, then went away again. But I didn't dare look." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind sharpened. Heavy footsteps could belong to only a few men in the village, and she could recall precisely who had broad enough shoulders to match the glove found at the vestry wall. As she spoke with the housekeeper, a voice interrupted from the lane. Colonel Melchett himself appeared, striding toward them with determined steps. He raised his hat politely, though his expression was guarded. "Miss Marple," he said briskly, "I hope you're not troubling Mrs. Briggs with questions. This is a delicate matter, and we mustn't alarm the staff unnecessarily." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Oh, I was merely admiring her flowers, Colonel. But you must agree the disappearance of those letters is troubling, quite daring to break into a locked desk." The Colonel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Daring, yes. But perhaps not so mysterious as all that. Linton may have destroyed them himself. Some men are like that, you know, keeping tokens until they fear discovery." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, though she thought his explanation altogether too convenient. "Perhaps," she said softly. When he left, Mrs. Briggs clutched Miss Marple's sleeve. "He doesn't want me talking, Miss Marple. I can see it plain, but I know those letters weren't destroyed. They were taken. And if you ask me, the Colonel fears what they might reveal." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Courage, my dear. Secrets have a way of surfacing, even when buried deep." That evening, Miss Marple was invited to supper with the Clements. The Reverend ate distractedly. Griselda chatted little else but the letters, and through it all, Miss Marple observed quietly. When the meal ended, she lingered by the vicarage window, gazing across the green. And there, in the dim light, she saw a figure slip out of Mr. Linton's cottage. Not Colonel Melchett this time, nor Constable Reeves, but a slighter figure, moving quickly and furtively with a bundle clutched close. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Another player in the game, another thread in the pattern. She said nothing to her hosts, but tucked the sight firmly into her memory. The stolen letters were at the heart of it all. She could feel it as surely as she felt the needle pricking her finger when her thread knotted. Yet it was not the letters alone, but what they represented. Pride, secrets, resentments, and perhaps a woman's hidden influence. As she walked home under the starlit sky, Miss Marple reflected that the village was already shifting under the weight of suspicion. Friends eyed one another differently. Voices dropped when certain names were mentioned. And in such fertile soil, lies sprouted faster than weeds in spring. She had scarcely reached her own doorstep when a hurried knock came at her door. Constable Reeves once more, pale and anxious. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "we found something else. Not in the cottage, but down by the brook, a torn scrap of paper. Looks like part of a letter, and it's got a woman's name on it." Miss Marple took the fragment carefully, reading the elegant script. A single word stared back at her: Margaret. She looked up at the constable, her expression unreadable. "Ah," she said softly. "So now the lady begins to step into the light." The fragment of paper lay on Miss Marple's small table, weighed down by her spectacles case. The elegant script, just one word. Margaret seemed to fill the room with unspoken questions. It was enough to set St. Mary Mead alight with speculation, and Miss Marple knew it would not remain a secret for long. In villages, news had a way of spreading faster than smoke through a thatched roof. The very next morning, whispers began. Mrs. Hartnell was heard declaring that the name must belong to Margaret Ellis, a spinster who lived with her sister on the edge of the village. "She's too quiet, far too quiet," Mrs. Hartnell insisted, tapping her umbrella on the flagstones. "And quiet ones always have the most to hide." Meanwhile, Mrs. Price Ridley countered loudly in the bakery that it was absurd to suspect poor Miss Ellis. Why, she barely leaves her cottage. No, the Margaret in question must be someone from London, perhaps a lady of society. That would explain his secret journeys. Mark my words, a woman from the city. At the tea shop, the theories grew wilder still. Mr. Pritchard leaned across the table, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "There's Margaret Hale, the niece of the innkeeper. She visited last summer, you'll recall. Spent a good deal of time speaking with Linton in the garden. I saw it with my own eyes." Miss Marple, sipping her tea quietly at the window table, did not join in. She listened, watching the way names were flung like stones and how eager each villager was to place blame anywhere but close to themselves. Later that day, Constable Reeves called on her again. He had the fragment of the letter folded neatly in his pocket, though he looked uncomfortable carrying it. "Colonel Melchett says it's no proof at all," Reeves said. "He thinks it might have been planted to distract us. But it does make one wonder, Miss Marple, who this Margaret could be." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "One must be careful, Constable. A name can illuminate, but it can also deceive. People will seize upon the obvious, but the truth often hides in the less likely corners." Reeves scratched his head. "Still, it puts me in a difficult position. Half the village is asking who Margaret is, and the other half is denying it's anyone they know." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She gazed out of her cottage window, watching Margaret Ellis herself pass slowly along the lane. The woman was small, neat, and timid in appearance, carrying a basket of sewing. She walked with eyes lowered, as though hoping to escape the notice of her neighbors. Miss Marple rose. "Perhaps, Constable, the best way to learn the truth is not through questions, but through listening. Let us see what Miss Ellis might reveal, not in what she says, but in what she avoids." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Ellis cottage. Margaret Ellis answered the door with a nervous start, her sister behind her, bustling about with a disapproving frown. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender and old books, its neatness almost excessive. "My dear," Miss Marple said warmly, "I was passing by and thought I'd call. I hear you've been working on some fine embroidery. I would really like to see it." Margaret blushed and invited her in, producing a length of fabric delicately stitched with roses. As she displayed her work, Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them. Miss Marple admired the detail sincerely, then remarked with apparent casualness, "Such patient work. It reminds me of Mr. Linton. He was said to have been a man of habits, too. Did you know him well?" The question, simple as it seemed, made Margaret falter. She looked down at her sewing, her voice barely audible. "Not well. No, not well at all." Her sister, sharper of tongue, interjected. "Nonsense, Margaret. He often walked you home from the post office last summer. I remember it quite clearly. Always polite he was. Too polite, if you ask me." Margaret's cheeks flushed, and she bent quickly over her stitching. That was nothing. Just kindness. Nothing at all. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though she tucked the reaction away in her mind. People rarely flushed over nothing. When she left the cottage, the evening light was sinking, casting long shadows across the village green. A group of children ran past, chanting and laughing, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The name had done its work. It had stirred the village, unsettled the quiet ones, and revealed, if not guilt, then unease. As she reached her own gate, she saw a figure waiting in the lane. Colonel Melchett stepped forward, his expression hard. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, "I must advise you not to meddle further. This inquiry is official business, and you're stirring up needless talk." Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "Colonel, gossip is not stirring brews of its own accord. One cannot prevent people from thinking, but one can observe what those thoughts bring to the surface." The colonel scowled, but she noticed the faint twitch of his jaw as he spoke. A man under pressure, irritated not only by gossip, but perhaps by something closer to himself. That night, Miss Marple sat with her knitting by the fire. The name Margaret echoed in her thoughts like a bell tolling faintly in the distance. A clue, yes, but also a test. The question was not only who Margaret was, but also who wished the village to think of her at all. And as the wind rattled the shutters, she could not shake the feeling that the real danger had only just begun to show its face. The village of St. Mary Mead was restless that night. Curtains twitched, lamps burned later than usual, and hushed conversations filled the lanes. The discovery of the letter fragment and the whispered name Margaret had unsettled even those with no connection to Mr. Linton. And beneath the hum of speculation, a quiet unease spread like a draught creeping under closed doors. Miss Marple sensed it as she sat in her drawing-room, knitting quietly by lamplight. Her needles clicked with patient rhythm, but her thoughts wandered over the threads of the case. The missing letters, the glove by the vestry wall, the colonel's too ready denials, and Margaret Ellis's nervous flush are all small stitches forming a larger pattern. She knew that somewhere in the weave lay the truth. Shortly after 9, the peace was broken. A knock rattled Miss Marple's door, hurried and insistent. When she opened it, she found young Tommy Ford, the grocer's boy, breathless and wide-eyed. "Miss Marple," he panted, "they say there's someone moving about in the churchyard again. Constable Reeves is down there, but he's calling for help. Said I was to fetch anyone close by." Miss Marple took her shawl at once. "Go along, Tommy, and tell your mother you've done your duty. I'll follow." The night air was sharp as she walked briskly toward the churchyard. From a distance she saw the beam of Constable Reeves's lantern sweeping across the gravestones. His voice rang out, firm but tense. "Who goes there?" "Show yourself." By the time Miss Marple arrived, several villagers had gathered at the gate, whispering and peering into the shadows. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her coat collar and declared loudly, "Mark my words, it's the murderer returning to gloat." "Hush," Miss Marple said softly, moving closer to Reeves. "What have you seen?" Reeves, lantern trembling slightly in his hand, pointed toward the yew trees. "A figure, Miss Marple. Tall, cloaked. It slipped behind the stones when I approached. I gave chase, but it vanished into the dark." Miss Marple peered into the gloom. The churchyard lay still, but the disturbed earth near the lich gate was clear enough to see. The soil had been scuffed, as though someone had knelt there. She bent to examine it while the villagers murmured nervously behind her. "There are fresh marks here," she observed quietly. Whoever it was, they were searching, perhaps for something that was dropped or hidden. Reeves nodded grimly. "I thought as much. Look there by the hedge." Something glinted faintly in the grass. Reeves stooped and picked it up, holding it carefully in the lantern's glow. A silver button, finely made, the kind one might find on an expensive coat. "A clue, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Perhaps," she said. "But we must note not only what is found, but also who will claim to have lost it." At that moment, a shriek broke from the crowd behind them. Mrs. Copley had spotted another movement, this time along the far wall of the churchyard. A shadow darted, swift and fleeting, before melting into the darkness beyond. "There," she cried, pointing. "Another one. There are two of them." The villagers gasped, the murmur rising into fearful chatter, but Miss Marple remained calm, her eyes sharp. Two shadows, two figures in the night. That was no accident. Constable Reeves turned to the crowd. "Everyone back to your homes at once. This is no place for gawking. Go on now." Grumbling and frightened, the villagers dispersed, though not without throwing nervous glances over their shoulders. Reeves, meanwhile, pocketed the silver button with care. Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. "Be cautious, Constable. Fear makes people careless, and carelessness makes truth harder to see. We must not confuse fright with fact." He nodded, though uneasily. "Still, two figures in the churchyard mean we've more to deal with than we thought." Miss Marple walked home beneath the watchful stars, her thoughts whirring. Two figures, a button, fresh marks by the lich gate. Someone had returned to the very place Mr. Linton's body was found, and not alone. That suggested collusion, secrecy shared between at least two. She let herself quietly into her cottage and set her shawl aside. The fire was low, but she did not rekindle it. Instead, she stood at the window, gazing across the village. Somewhere in the darkness, secrets stirred restlessly, struggling to remain hidden, and Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and steady patience, knew she would wait as long as it took for them to emerge into the light. The faintest smile touched her lips as she whispered to herself, "Yes, two shadows make a darker night." The morning after the churchyard incident, St. Mary Mead buzzed like a hive of unsettled bees. The tale of two figures lurking among the graves spread swiftly, each retelling more dramatic than the last. By the time the sun was high, the shadowy figures had become burglars, ghosts, or even secret lovers meeting under cover of night. No detail was too fanciful for village tongues. Miss Marple, however, paid little mind to embellishments. Her thoughts turned instead to the silver button. Small things, she knew, often carried the greatest weight. Over breakfast, she pictured it in her mind's eye. Polished, finely made, the sort of fastener seen on expensive coats. It was not the possession of a poor man, nor the type likely to be left carelessly behind. By mid-morning, Constable Reeves came to her cottage with the button in an envelope. He looked weary, as though the burden of mystery weighed heavier with each day. "I've shown it to half the men in the village," he reported. "None will claim it. Some barely looked at it before shaking their heads. Others stared too long, as if considering what to say. But no one admits it as theirs." Miss Marple opened the envelope and studied the button again. "Did you notice," she said softly, "that the engraving is not English? That is continental work, French or perhaps Belgian. I wonder who among our villagers has the taste or the means for such tailoring." Reeves frowned. "Colonel Melchett, perhaps. He's a man of means." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone carried no conviction. "But the colonel is practical. His coats are a solid English cut, built for utility rather than elegance. No, this button belonged to someone more particular. The constable left soon after, muttering about widening his search, but Miss Marple had already resolved upon another course. She walked to the high street, where the villagers gathered at the tea shop, and she listened. At a side table, Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court. The button must belong to a stranger, she insisted. No one here wears such finery. It proves what I've said all along, that some outsider is responsible. Mark my words, this was no village quarrel. Mr. Pritchard, sipping his tea, shook his head. Outsider or not, the fact remains the figure was seen in the churchyard. Why would a stranger return to the very spot where the body was found? That smacks of someone with a personal stake. Miss Marple allowed their debate to flow, then interjected gently, "Buttons have a way of telling tales, you know. A missing button can be as damning as a signed confession if one knows where to look." The room quieted at her remark, though Griselda Clement, who had just entered, laughed lightly. "Oh, Miss Marple, you make it sound as though all of St. Mary Mead should check their coats this very instant." "That might not be unwise," Miss Marple replied mildly, though her eyes caught Margaret Ellis at the far end of the room. Margaret had frozen at the mention of coats, her needlework lying idle in her lap. Later that day, Miss Marple called upon the dressmaker, Mrs. Penrose, whose tiny shop stood by the post office. Few in the village could afford new garments often, but Mrs. Penrose had a sharp memory for fabrics and trimmings. "My dear," Miss Marple said as she admired a bolt of fabric, "you have such an eye for details. Tell me, have you ever seen this sort of button before?" She produced the silver disc from her handbag. Mrs. Penrose examined it closely. "Oh, indeed, Miss Marple, this is not English work. It came from a French tailor's coat. I recall it very well, for I replaced one just like it only last month. It belonged to Mr. Edmund Sharp, the solicitor's nephew. He ordered the coat from Paris and was so proud of it he could hardly stop speaking about it." Miss Marple thanked her warmly, though inwardly she was already arranging the pieces. Edmund Sharp was young, ambitious, and far more fashionable than most villagers. And if a button from his prized coat had turned up in the churchyard on the very night of the disturbance, then his connection to the affair could hardly be denied. That evening, she observed him herself. Edmund was at the inn, leaning against the bar with forced nonchalance, his coat buttoned tightly. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw what others missed. The top button was mismatched, an ordinary replacement where once the fine silver had been. She drew no attention to it then, merely noted the detail and stored it away. But her mind was alive with questions. Why had Edmund Sharp been near the churchyard at night, and who was the second shadow moving beside him? The mystery deepened, threads tangling, into patterns that only patience could unravel. As Miss Marple returned home through the quiet lanes, she whispered to herself, "A button may seem small, but it can fasten together the truth as neatly as a seamstress with her thread." And in the silence of her cottage, she knew the next step must be to discover not just whose button it was, but also what Mr. Edmund Sharp had been doing in the shadows of the churchyard. The revelation about the silver button pointed unmistakably toward Edmund Sharp, the solicitor's nephew. Young, ambitious, and with a touch of vanity in his choice of clothes, Edmund had never quite blended into the quiet fabric of St. Mary Mead. His presence was always slightly too polished, his manners too carefully rehearsed, as though he were performing for an audience larger than the village itself. Miss Marple knew that kind of young man very well. She had seen their sort before, full of dreams, often reckless and dangerously careless when ambition pressed against temptation. A button missing from a Parisian coat was not conclusive, but it was enough to raise questions. And questions in a small village were like sparks near dry straw. That morning, Constable Reeves stopped at Miss Marple's garden gate with news. "We've spoken to Edmund, Miss Marple. He claims the button was lost days ago at the inn. He says it fell off when he caught it on a chair. The innkeeper remembers nothing of the sort." "And how did young Mr. Sharp take your questions?" Miss Marple asked, her knitting needles clicking gently. Reeves frowned. "Bit too smooth, if you ask me." He smiled and spoke politely, but he wouldn't quite meet my eye. And when I mentioned the churchyard, he changed the subject faster than a man scalded by tea. Miss Marple gave a small nod. "It is often so with the young. They mistake quickness for cleverness, forgetting that quickness leaves more traces than patience does." That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the solicitor's office. Mr. Henry Sharp, Edmund's uncle, was bent over a stack of papers, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up with surprise when she entered. "Why, Miss Marple?" he said. "This is a rare visit." "How can I be of service?" "I came only to inquire after your nephew," Miss Marple replied kindly. "I understand he has been much in company at the inn of late." Mr. Sharp sighed heavily. "Yes, Edmund spends more time there than I'd like. He is bright enough, but he's restless. London would suit him better, though I dare say he hasn't the means yet. He has ambitions, you see, more than a little pride." "Ambition is no bad thing," Miss Marple observed softly, "unless it leads one into dangerous company." The solicitor's brows knitted. "Dangerous company? What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that ambition, when paired with secrets, often tempts one toward peril. Secrets, I find, are heavier than ambition can carry." She left him, puzzled, but her words were not for him alone. As she walked back through the village, she spotted Edmund himself emerging from the inn. He was finely dressed, coat buttoned up, though the mismatched button betrayed him still. When he saw Miss Marple, he tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a touch too light. "And to you, Mr. Sharp," she answered. "I hope your coat serves you better now. Such fine tailoring deserves careful keeping." A flicker crossed his face, only for a second, but Miss Marple saw it. He recovered quickly, laughing. "Ah, yes, one mustn't be careless, must one? Though I seem to have the worst luck with buttons." "Luck," Miss Marple said mildly, "is often more about where one chooses to walk." For the briefest instant, Edmund's eyes narrowed. Then, with another polite bow, he excused himself and strode off. That evening, in the tea shop, Edmund's name was on every tongue. "Mrs. Price." Ridley leaned forward, her voice low but insistent. "He was seen near the churchyard. Mark my words, the boy's too fine for honest work. Where does his money come from? I'd like to know." Mr. Pritchard shook his head gravely. "I heard he argued with Mr. Linton about a matter of fees, something to do with legal papers. Linton accused him of incompetence, and young Edmund didn't take it well." The villagers murmured agreement, each story feeding the next. And in the corner, Miss Marple listened, sipping her tea quietly. She noted the eagerness with which suspicion had shifted toward Edmund, too eager perhaps. A scapegoat could be useful, and ambitious young men often made convenient ones. When she returned home, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered the day. Edmund Sharp was concealing something, of which she was certain. His evasions, his hurried excuses, and the betraying detail of his coat spoke volumes. Yet she sensed he was not alone in this affair. 2 shadows had been seen in the churchyard, not one. As she set aside her knitting, a faint sound outside caught her ear, the crunch of hurried footsteps on the lane. She rose and moved quietly to the window. In the dim glow of the street lamp, she saw Edmund Sharp again. He was not alone. A slighter figure walked beside him, close enough to suggest secrecy, quick enough to suggest fear. Miss Marple watched as they disappeared into the darkness toward the brook, where the first letter fragment had been found. Her eyes sharpened, and she whispered to herself, So the pattern begins to reveal itself. The young man is not the only one entangled in this thread. The lane that led to the brook was a narrow one, flanked by hedgerows that seemed darker than the night itself. Miss Marple did not follow Edmund Sharp and his companion, but she watched them until they vanished from sight. Her eyes, sharp despite her years, caught the slighter figure's nervous gestures, the way a hand clutched at a shawl and the hurried tilt of the head. A woman, she thought, though she could not yet be sure who. The next morning, the brook was the subject of gossip in the tea shop. Someone had seen lantern light flickering there after midnight. Mrs. Turner, polishing her counter, claimed her cousin's boy swore he heard voices urgently whispered, and not of strangers. No thieves or vagrants, she declared. It was village folk. I'll wager my best scones on it. Miss Marple sat at her usual table, quietly attentive. She had already taken a walk by the brook herself before breakfast. The dew on the grass had revealed footprints, one large and one small, pressed deep into the mud near the water's edge. And there, half hidden among reeds, she had found a ribbon, pale blue, torn at one end. She had tucked it carefully into her knitting bag before anyone else arrived. At the vicarage later that day, Griselda Clement was full of questions. "Jane, have you heard? Edmund Sharp was seen out late. They say he's been meeting a woman. Do you suppose she is the mysterious Margaret? Wouldn't it be thrilling if it were so?" Reverend Clement frowned over his teacup. "Griselda, please. This is not material for speculation." But Miss Marple merely smiled. "Human nature thrives on speculation, Leonard. The trouble is that people often prefer exciting tales to simple truths." Griselda leaned forward eagerly. "But you think it is true, don't you? That Edmund was out with a woman?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that he was certainly not alone, and that matters very much." That evening, Constable Reeves came to her cottage, bringing with him an expression of frustration. "Miss Marple, I tried again with Edmund. I asked him plainly if he was near the brook last night. He denied it and swore he was at the inn the whole evening. But when I pressed," he grew sharp, "he said it was beneath his dignity to be spied on like a common thief." Miss Marple's eyes softened with quiet amusement. "Ah, dignity. Such a brittle thing, Constable. It often shatters when pressed too firmly." Reeves scowled. "He's hiding something, that much is certain. But without proof, Colonel Melchett won't act. Says the boy's words are as good as mine." Miss Marple lifted her knitting bag and drew out the pale ribbon. "Perhaps this will help. Found by the brook, where two sets of footprints stood close together. I would very much like to know which lady in the village has lately mislaid such a ribbon." The constable's eyes widened. "A woman's ribbon? Then it's true. He was with someone." Miss Marple tucked the ribbon back into her bag. "The truth will out, Constable, but sometimes it needs a little nudge." That night, Miss Marple attended the Women's Institute meeting at the hall. The ladies gathered in their Sunday best, chattering about the murder as though it were an item on the agenda. And there, amid the laughter and whispers, Miss Marple observed carefully. When tea was served, she produced the ribbon with a casual remark. "I found this near the brook this morning. Such a pretty shade of blue. It reminded me of one I had many years ago. There was a flutter of interest, but it was Margaret Ellis, whose face drained of color. She touched her hair nervously, her fingers searching as though for something absent. Her lips parted, but no words came. Griselda noticed too. Why, Margaret, don't you often wear ribbons like that in your hair? I'm sure I saw you with one only yesterday. Margaret stammered. I may have dropped it somewhere. I can't quite recall. Her voice was too hurried, her denial too fragile. Miss Marple said nothing more, but she saw the tremor in Margaret's hands. The same tremor she had seen when the woman spoke of Mr. Linton days before. It was not guilt written plainly, but it was fear, and fear, Miss Marple knew, was often the more telling of the two. Later, as she walked home beneath the pale moonlight, Miss Marple turned the matter over in her mind. Edmund Sharp, ambitious and reckless. Margaret Ellis, timid yet drawn into secrecy. A midnight meeting at the brook. The missing letters. The pattern was tightening, the threads crossing more closely now, and as she reached her gate, Miss Marple murmured softly, "Yes, the truth is sewing itself together, and before long the seams will show." The following morning, the blue ribbon had become the chief subject of conversation in every corner of St. Mary Mead. Those who had been at the Women's Institute repeated the scene to those who had not, and with each retelling, Margaret Ellis's hesitation grew more damning. By midday, it was firmly established in village gossip that Margaret had met Edmund Sharp by the brook. And if she had met him, then she must know far more about Mr. Linton's death than she dared to admit. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained quiet. Gossip might leap to conclusions, but she knew human nature well enough to wait for the truth to show itself. Still, she could not ignore how pale Margaret had turned when the ribbon was produced. Fear was a curious thing. It often revealed more than words. Constable Reeves visited her cottage before luncheon, his brow furrowed. "I've spoken to Margaret Ellis," he said. She denied being out with Edmund and denied ever going near the brook at night. But her sister contradicted her and said Margaret was out late, though she didn't say where. The two nearly quarreled in front of me. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "Contradictions, Constable, are like loose threads in a garment. Pull gently, and the whole pattern begins to unravel. Tell me, did Margaret explain how she lost her ribbon?" Reeves shook his head. "No explanation at all. Just kept saying she must have dropped it somewhere. She was trembling so much I thought she might faint." Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Yes, it is not always guilt that makes people tremble. Sometimes it is the weight of knowing too much." That afternoon, she walked to the high street and found the tea shop more crowded than usual. Mrs. Price Ridley was in her element, leaning forward over her teacup and declaring in loud tones, "Mark my words, Margaret Ellis is at the bottom of this." A woman, scorned or jealous, why else would she sneak out at midnight? Mrs. Hartnell nodded eagerly. And with Edmund Sharp, too, a respectable young lady shouldn't be meeting men in the dark, not even nephews of solicitors. No wonder she turned pale when Jane Marple showed the ribbon. From her corner table, Miss Marple observed the scene quietly. She had long known that once gossip fastened upon a victim, it rarely loosened its grip. Yet something about Margaret's fear troubled her. It was not the fear of being caught in impropriety, but something deeper, sharper, as though she feared harm itself. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple took her customary walk near the churchyard. There she encountered Griselda Clement, brisk and talkative as ever. "Oh, Jane," Griselda cried. "You've heard, haven't you? There's been another disturbance." Margaret Ellis fainted dead away at the post office this morning. They say she received a letter, an anonymous one, unsigned, with only the words, "Keep silent or the brook will tell." Can you imagine? Anonymous letters, here in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's face remained composed, but her eyes grew keen. "And what became of this letter, my dear?" Her sister snatched it at once, but word is it's been given to Colonel Melchett. He's furious. He says he won't have anonymous threats turning the village into a theatre. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Anonymous letters are like masks, Griselda. They hide the writer's face, but reveal the writer's fears." That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong, where the villagers' glances spoke louder than their prayers. Margaret Ellis sat with her sister, pale and withdrawn, eyes lowered throughout the service. Edmund Sharp was present too, shifting uneasily on the opposite pew, his gaze flickering toward Margaret more than once. Colonel Melchett stood stern and upright near the back, his jaw set as if determined to silence the growing unrest. Afterward, as the congregation spilled into the cool night air, Miss Marple lingered near the gate. She watched as Edmund approached Margaret, bending to speak in a low, urgent tone. Margaret shook her head violently, pulling away from him before hurrying off with her sister. Edmund stood alone for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides, then turned sharply and strode into the darkness. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, secrets, threats, and midnight meetings. The pattern was tightening, and with it came danger. When she returned home, she found Constable Reeves waiting at her gate once more. His face was pale. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, "there's been another incident. Someone tried to break into the Ellis cottage tonight. The window by the garden was forced, though nothing seems to have been taken. The sisters are frightened half to death." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Ah, so the danger grows bolder. First letters, then shadows, and now a forced window. Whoever is behind this wishes to silence Margaret completely. That constable tells us she knows far more than she dares speak." Reeves swallowed hard. "Do you think she's in real danger?" Miss Marple's reply was calm, but her gaze was grave. "Yes, Constable. Danger often comes to those who hold the thread that might unravel the whole tangle, and Margaret Ellis, poor timid creature, has that thread in her hands whether she wishes it or not." The constable looked around uneasily at the darkened lane as though expecting shadows to stir. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Stay vigilant, my dear. The truth is pressing closer, but so too is desperation." The night after the forced window at the Ellis cottage, St. Mary Mead seemed to draw its curtains tighter. Doors were bolted early, lamps were kept burning longer, and every creak of timber in the wind sounded like an intruder. Yet beneath this surface of caution, the village buzzed with more speculation than ever. People whispered that the killer had turned his sights on Margaret Ellis, and that meant she must know something crucial. Miss Marple did not rely on whispers. She sat by her fire with her knitting, reflecting quietly on what she had seen. Margaret's fear, Edmund Sharp's agitation, and the anonymous letter warning her to remain silent were signs of someone trying desperately to suppress the truth. And desperation, Miss Marple knew, was often the clearest trail to follow. It was near midnight when Constable Reeves knocked sharply at her door. She found him pale and out of breath, lantern in hand. "Miss Marple," he gasped, "there's been another attempt. Someone tried to break into the Ellis cottage again tonight, and this time they nearly succeeded." Margaret was woken by the sound of the latch. When her sister shouted, the intruder fled. Miss Marple took her shawl at once. "I shall come, Constable. It will not do to leave the poor women alone after such a fright." The Ellis cottage stood dark and anxious. The sisters huddled together in the sitting room, their faces white with fear. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl. Her sister spoke indignantly, though her own eyes betrayed alarm. "We shall not stay here another night if this continues. To be terrorized in one's own home is scandalous." Miss Marple moved gently to Margaret's side. "My dear, you must not let fear silence you. Whoever is behind this wishes you to keep quiet, and that means what you know matters very much indeed." Margaret looked at her with wide, tearful eyes. "I don't know, Miss Marple. Truly, I don't. I only—" She stopped herself, her lips trembling. Her sister pressed her hand. "Say it, Margaret. You cannot carry it alone." Margaret drew a shaky breath. "I only know that Mr. Linton was afraid. He told me so the night before he died. He said someone had discovered the letters. He begged me not to mention them to anyone, for fear it would bring ruin. I thought he exaggerated. But now he's gone, and the letters too." The room was silent, save for the clock ticking on the mantel. Miss Marple laid her hand gently on Margaret's arm. And did he tell you who threatened him?" Margaret shook her head, tears brimming. Number only that it was someone in the village, someone who would do anything to keep the past from being uncovered. Constable Reeves stiffened. Then that explains it. She knows enough to make the culprit desperate. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, desperate enough to prowl in the night. But we must be cautious. Fear can lead to rash acts, and rash acts may yet spill more blood. The following morning, the attempted break-in was all the village could speak of. At the tea shop, Mrs. Price Ridley proclaimed, "I always said Margaret Ellis was mixed up in it. Why else would someone try so hard to silence her?" Mrs. Hartnell nodded gravely. "It is the work of a guilty conscience. Mark my words, she knows who the murderer is, but she dares not say." Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual place, sipping her tea, while the others speculated wildly. She noted how Edmund Sharp entered the shop mid-discussion, his face tight. At the mention of Margaret's name, he interrupted brusquely, "You must leave Miss Ellis alone. She has nothing to do with this matter." The vehemence of his defense drew more attention than sympathy. The villagers exchanged meaningful glances, their whispers quickening. Edmund's hands shook as he lifted his cup, and he soon left with hasty steps. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind busy. Young love could make men reckless, but so too could fear of discovery. If Edmund had indeed been Margaret's companion at the brook, then he was more deeply entangled than he wished to admit. That evening, Miss Marple prepared her fire and took up her knitting once more. But her eyes strayed often to the window, watching the lane outside. The pattern of events was becoming clearer now. The first death, the missing letters, the silver button, the midnight meetings, and the attempts to silence Margaret. Each thread led back to the same knot, one that tied together pride, ambition, and secrets long hidden. As the clock struck 10, she set her knitting down and whispered to herself, "Yes, the noose is tightening. But the more it tightens, the more dangerous it becomes." The danger, she knew, had not yet reached its peak. By the next morning, the attempted break-in at the Ellis cottage had hardened into certainty in the villagers' minds. It was no longer a matter of whether Margaret knew something, but what exactly she was hiding. The air in St. Mary Mead felt charged, as though the little cottages and gardens themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next revelation. Miss Marple, however, was never one to wait idly. She had seen too many patterns of human folly repeat themselves over the years. She understood that gossip could be as destructive as any weapon, but it could also reveal truths if one listened closely enough. So she chose her steps with care, making her quiet rounds through the village, pausing here and there to drop a remark and watch the ripples it created. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Hartnell was loudly telling the clerk that Margaret Ellis should be placed under constant watch. The girl is as pale as milk and trembling as though she'd seen the ghost of Mr. Linton himself. If that doesn't prove guilt, I don't know what does. Miss Marple smiled politely and interjected, "I always think trembling proves more often fear than guilt, don't you? And one ought to ask what it is she fears most." The remark had its intended effect. Mrs. Hartnell faltered, then sniffed indignantly, unwilling to admit she hadn't considered that possibility. Later, at the tea shop, Miss Marple deliberately let slip a comment about Edmund Sharp. "Such a fine coat he wears. I dare say the tailor must have been very proud of his work, though I wonder if it's comfortable to walk in the mud with such garments." The remark, mild on the surface, set tongues wagging immediately. The silver button was remembered, and soon the room hummed with speculation about Edmund's nightly wanderings. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly, observing how each person responded. Edmund's name provoked knowing glances, while Margaret's name drew pity from some and disdain from others. By late afternoon, the gossip had taken a more sinister turn. Rumours spread that Edmund and Margaret had been seen together more often than they admitted, and that the letters might have bound them both to Mr. Linton in some compromising way. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement reported the whispers with relish. "They say Margaret was in love with Linton himself," she told Miss Marple. "Can you imagine? A timid little mouse like her entangled with a man of secrets. And when he turned elsewhere, jealousy drove her to madness." The Reverend frowned, clearly troubled. "Griselda, we cannot let idle chatter condemn an innocent woman." "Miss Marple, what do you think?" Miss Marple's expression was serene. "I think jealousy is very seldom the sole cause of crime. It is often mixed with pride, with desperation, and with fear of disgrace. But what interests me most is not why Margaret might be jealous, but why someone is so determined that we should believe she is." Her remark silenced them both, though Griselda could not resist a small shiver of delight. That evening, Miss Marple decided to take a walk past the inn. Through the window she glimpsed Edmund Sharp, sitting alone at a table, his head bent low. His coat was neatly fastened, though the replacement button glared out at her sharp eyes like a guilty secret. She watched as he scribbled furiously on a scrap of paper, then crumpled it and shoved it into his pocket. As she turned away, she nearly collided with Colonel Melchett himself. His expression was grim, his manner brusque. "Miss Marple," he said, "you must stop stirring these people. The village is in uproar, and your little remarks only make it worse." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "I do not stir, Colonel. I merely listen. It is others who create the uproar. But I dare say one can learn a great deal from watching how people react to it." The Colonel flushed slightly and muttered something about her meddling, but Miss Marple noted his unease. He was too quick to blame her, too anxious to keep control of the story. That in itself was telling. Later, at home, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. Edmund's secrecy, Margaret's fear, and the Colonel's agitation all pointed to a knot of truth tightening. She had the sense that the culprit, whoever they were, was being pushed into a corner, and people in corners were often dangerous. She had just set down her knitting when a hurried knock came at the door. It was Constable Reeves again, lantern in hand, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he said in a strained whisper, "there's been another incident. Margaret Ellis is missing. Her sister swears she went to fetch water from the pump, and she never came back." Miss Marple rose at once, her eyes sharp despite her gentle manner. Then, "Constable, we must find her quickly. For if Margaret holds the thread that unravels this tangle, someone has decided to cut it." The disappearance of Margaret Ellis spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed of a fire carried by wind. By dawn, the entire village was in a state of agitation. Men gathered in knots along the green, whispering grimly, while women stood at cottage doors, their faces pale with speculation. It was no longer just murder they whispered of, but abduction, or worse. Miss Marple had risen early, her manner calm, but her mind alert. She had lived long enough to know that panic seldom produced answers. It only clouded them. Still, the air of fear was unmistakable. She noted the way even the children were hushed as they played, as though the shadows had grown thicker since Margaret's vanishing. Constable Reeves came to her cottage before breakfast, looking more strained than ever. "We searched through the night, Miss Marple. Every lane, every hedge, every field on the edge of the village. No sign of her. Her sister is beside herself and swears she only stepped out for a moment to fetch water." Miss Marple poured him tea, her expression thoughtful. "Fear has its own urgency, Constable. Margaret knew she was in danger. I dare say she may have gone to meet someone, hoping to resolve the matter or been persuaded to do so." Reeves ran a hand over his face. "It may be Edmund. Some say he was seen near the pump about the same time. But when I asked him this morning, he denied it, claimed he never left the inn." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "And yet one cannot help but recall the two shadows in the churchyard. He is not the only one who moves by night. By midday, Colonel Melchett had taken command of the search, his voice carried across the green as he ordered men to spread out in pairs. Check the brook, the fields, and the woodland paths. Leave no stone unturned. The safety of this village depends on finding her. But Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, noticed something telling. The colonel's voice was stern, but his hands betrayed a faint tremor. And when a villager mentioned the missing letters, he cut them short so quickly that the interruption hung in the air like an echo. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call at the Ellis cottage. Margaret's sister sat pale and distraught, wringing her hands. "They say she ran away," she sobbed. But Margaret would never. She was timid, yes, but loyal. If she left, it was because she was forced to. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Did she speak of anyone in particular the night before? Any appointment? Any plan?" The sister hesitated. She mentioned Edmund's name. Only once in passing. She said he warned her to keep quiet, or there would be trouble. She seemed terrified after that. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then Edmund is more deeply entwined than he admits. But threats, my dear, are the tools of the frightened, not always of the guilty. We must not forget that." Evening fell with no sign of Margaret. Lanterns bobbed along the lanes as the search widened. Villagers gathered at the vicarage for news, their voices hushed but sharp with speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley declared flatly, "It is plain enough." Margaret knew too much about Mr. Linton's letters, and Edmund silenced her. "It is the only explanation." "Not the only one," Miss Marple interjected softly, though few were listening. "There are other hands in this game, hands perhaps more careful than young Mr. Sharp's." Griselda leaned toward her, eyes wide. "But surely, Jane, you don't mean the Colonel. People have been whispering ever since he grew so cross about the gossip." Could it be him? Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Whispers are like smoke, my dear. They drift toward whichever chimney looks darkest, but the fire may lie elsewhere." As the villagers speculated, Miss Marple slipped quietly away. She walked along the lane toward the brook, her steps measured, her eyes alert. The water shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and there, half hidden among the reeds, she found what she had expected, a second ribbon, torn, muddied, and unmistakably Margaret's. She bent to pick it up, her fingers light, her gaze calm. "So," she murmured softly, "the threads converged at last. The brook holds more secrets than it shows." When she returned to her cottage, she set the ribbon beside the first on her table. 2 pieces of the same story, 2 warnings unheeded. And as she sat with her knitting untouched in her lap, she whispered to herself, "Margaret is still alive." She must be. But if she is to be found, it must be soon, for the net is closing, and desperation makes killers bold. The disappearance of Margaret Ellis had pushed the village into a fever of speculation, but Miss Marple was not idle. She understood that when fear was greatest, a small remark could reveal more than an hour of questioning. So she began her quiet work stitching together a net, not of rope, but of human frailty and unguarded words. Her first call that day was at the vicarage. Griselda, flushed with excitement, was already rehearsing the latest rumor. "They say Edmund was seen with a bundle last night, hurrying toward the brook." Oh, Jane, if it was Margaret's body, Reverend Clement silenced her with a glare, but Miss Marple only smiled gently. "Bundles can carry many things, Griselda, but the truth is lighter and slips through wrappings if one is not careful. I should be more curious to know why Edmund is so anxious for us to look one way and not another." Her next stop was the inn. Edmund sat in the corner, pale, his eyes shadowed by lack of sleep. When Miss Marple approached, he forced a smile. "Miss Marple," he said too brightly, "I trust you're not here to accuse me of mischief as well. Half the village seems determined to make me the villain." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh no, young man, not the villain, but perhaps a little careless with secrets. I wonder, was it wise to walk by the brook at night when people's eyes are so sharp?" His hand clenched around his glass. "I was not at the brook," he said sharply. "I told the constable that already." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Ah, yes, and yet the mud has a way of clinging to boots, whether one wills it or not." For a moment, Edmund froze. Then he laughed too quickly and excused himself. She watched him leave, noting how his step faltered at the doorway. It was the falter of a man cornered, not yet caught, but conscious the walls were closing in. By afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Ellis cottage. Margaret's sister sat weeping softly, her grief tinged with bitterness. They will blame her for everything, poor child. She was timid, yes, but she had no wickedness in her. Someone has taken her, and no one dares to admit it. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Take heart, my dear. Margaret has not gone without trace. Threads always remain, and I think we shall soon find where they lead." Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple paused at the lane. Colonel Melchett stood not far off, speaking brusquely with Constable Reeves. His words carried, sharper than he intended. "We must put an end to this nonsense, Reeves. The villagers are losing their heads, and this old woman's meddling does more harm than good." Miss Marple did not betray a flicker of offense. She stepped forward calmly, her voice mild. "I quite agree, Colonel. Hysteria must be avoided. Perhaps then we should gather everyone concerned in one place, where matters may be put plainly. Secrets thrive in corners, but under light they wither." Colonel Melchett scowled but gave a curt nod. "Very well. Tomorrow evening at the vicarage, all parties present. We'll settle this foolishness then." Miss Marple thanked him with a serene smile, though inwardly she felt the net drawing tight. A gathering was precisely what she required. With all the suspects together, the smallest slip could expose the truth. That evening, as she sat by her fire with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the threads she had gathered. Edmund sharp, reckless and evasive. Margaret Ellis, fearful and silenced. Colonel Melchett, defensive and quick to anger. And behind them all, the vanished letters, the silver button, the midnight meetings, and now Margaret's disappearance. The pattern was nearly complete. All that remained was to let it reveal itself, as embroidery does when the final stitch is set. As the church bell rang 9, Miss Marple whispered softly to herself, "Tomorrow the tangle will show its true design. But tonight the guilty heart will beat the loudest." And as the wind rattled the shutters of her quiet cottage, she knew that the net was closing in, and there was no longer room for the culprit to escape. The vicarage drawing-room was lit more brightly than usual that evening. Lamps glowed from every corner, as though the Reverend Clement and his wife hoped the light itself might chase away the shadows that had fallen over St. Mary Mead. But no brightness could soften the tension in the air. One by one, the villagers arrived, faces pale and voices hushed, until the room was crowded with uneasy bodies and sharper glances. Colonel Melchett stood near the fireplace, arms folded, his expression severe. He had insisted on the gathering, though his manner betrayed little appetite for it now. Constable Reeves hovered at his side, his notes tucked nervously into his pocket. Edmund Sharp was among the first to enter, dressed carefully as always, though his youthful swagger had dimmed. He greeted the vicar stiffly and then sat near the window, his eyes restless. A mismatched button gleamed faintly on his coat, and more than one villager noticed it. Margaret Ellis arrived late, escorted by her anxious sister. She looked pale, thinner than before, as though her days of fear had worn her to a thread. She kept her eyes lowered, refusing to meet Edmund's gaze, though he glanced at her often, his jaw tight with unspoken words. Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Hartnell entered together, whispering already, eager to witness what they believed would be a reckoning. Griselda Clement bustled about with tea trays, though her curiosity gleamed brighter than The cups she set down. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual chair, knitting in hand, her needles clicking softly. She seemed more like a benign spectator than an investigator, her gentle eyes roving the room with mild interest. Yet she missed nothing. The clenched fist of Edmund, the trembling hands of Margaret, and the sharp glances exchanged between villagers who feared exposure. The Reverend cleared his throat. "My friends, we gather tonight in the hope of easing our village's distress. There has been a most dreadful crime, and the peace of St. Mary Mead has been broken. Perhaps by speaking openly, we may reach some understanding." Colonel Melchett stepped forward, his voice brisk. "Enough whispers. The matter concerns Mr. Linton's death and the theft of certain letters from his cottage. We know someone in this room has knowledge they've yet to share, and I mean to see it brought to light." The words hung heavy, and the silence that followed was broken only by the faint clink of Griselda's teacups. Miss Marple let her knitting needles pause mid-click. "I think," she said gently, "that silence is not the absence of truth, but the presence of fear. If we look at who is most afraid, we may find what we seek." Her calm voice seemed to draw every eye. Edmund shifted in his seat, his mouth opening as if to speak, but he caught himself. Margaret shrank further into her chair, twisting her shawl. Mrs. Price Ridley could restrain herself no longer. It is Margaret who knows. Why else would there have been attempts on her life? Why else would she faint at the post office? She's at the heart of this. Margaret's sister bristled. "My sister has done nothing but suffer. It is she who is hunted, not the hunter." Edmund rose suddenly, his voice sharp. "Leave her alone. If anyone's to blame, it's—" He stopped himself abruptly, biting the words back, and sat down heavily, his face flushed. Colonel Melchett's eyes narrowed. "If anyone's to blame, Mr. Sharp—" "Do finish your sentence." But Edmund pressed his lips together, staring stubbornly at the floor. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "Young men often speak before they think, Colonel. But what matters is not what they say aloud, but what they cannot say at all." The air in the room grew thicker, the tension almost palpable. Even Griselda's lively chatter had faded into silence. It seemed as though every villager's breath was held, waiting for the net to close. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly in her lap and looked around the room, her expression mild. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we should not think only of Margaret or Edmund. There are others here whose silence has been most curious. Silence, after all, can be the loudest noise in a room." Her eyes came to rest briefly on Colonel Melchett, who stiffened, then looked away. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, each strike echoing in the charged stillness. Margaret's hand fluttered to her throat, Edmund's jaw tightened further, and Reeves scribbled nervously in his notebook. Miss Marple's gaze returned to her knitting. "Yes," she murmured, more to herself than to the room, "I think the time is very nearly coming. The pattern is complete. It only waits to be turned to the light." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. They could sense it too. The truth was pressing at the edges, ready to break free. But for the moment, the drawing-room sat in taut silence, as though the village itself were holding its breath for what Miss Marple would reveal. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was cool, carrying a faint scent of roses from the village gardens, yet the atmosphere in Miss Marple's drawing-room was tense with anticipation. Every chair was occupied, and the villagers' eyes flicked nervously between one another, whispering soft conjectures, the edges of suspicion brushing across every gaze. Miss Marple sat poised in her favorite armchair, knitting needles resting idly in her lap, her sharp eyes scanning each familiar face as though she were weighing the very weight of their souls. She cleared her throat gently, drawing the room's attention, and began speaking in that unassuming, deliberate tone that had guided so many to the truth. "It seems," she said, that the solution to our puzzle has been hiding in plain sight, obscured only by our assumptions and the convenience of appearances. The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock, each second punctuating the rising tension. The first hint she offered concerned the sequence of the telegrams that had arrived the previous week, the peculiar phrasing that seemed almost trivial at first. It was not just the words themselves, but their timing, she continued, lifting a small piece of paper with the postmark visible. Each message was designed to mislead, to suggest urgency where none existed, and to calm where alarm should have been felt. Our culprit counted on us to see the obvious rather than the subtle. Eyes widened around the room as murmurs spread, but Miss Marple raised a hand, urging patience. Now, consider the behavior of those closest to the victim in the days leading up to the incident. Anxiety, distraction, even casual avoidance, small things perhaps, but revealing under scrutiny. She leaned forward, her expression gentle yet unyielding. One person, in particular, demonstrated the perfect combination of feigned concern and misdirected attention. Gasps emerged, and several villagers exchanged quick glances, trying to read one another's reactions. Miss Marple allowed a moment, letting the unease settle fully before continuing. It was Mr. Aldridge. Always attentive, always helpful, but when we examine the chain of events, he was invariably present at every crucial turning point, yet never truly involved. A shadow moving among the light. Her voice carried no accusation, only the calm certainty of reason. She rose, walking slowly to the fireplace, gesturing toward the evidence gathered, the scattered notes, the open cabinet, and the misplaced keys. Mr. Aldridge had the motive, the knowledge of the household routines, and, most importantly, the means to orchestrate the events so meticulously that suspicion would fall elsewhere. Each act was a thread in a tapestry of deception, crafted with care and subtlety. A ripple of astonishment went through the audience. Some faces showed disbelief, others the dawning comprehension that the quiet, seemingly devoted neighbor could bear such duplicity. Miss Marple's voice softened slightly, yet retained its clarity. He believed himself cleverer than all of us, counting on human nature's inclination to see what is expected rather than what is true. Yet truth, though patient, cannot be denied indefinitely. She paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing with the final piece of the puzzle, the motive. Mr. Aldridge envied the household's prosperity and the respect accorded to its head. His actions were born not of passion, but of calculated ambition, a desire to shift fortune and status to himself under the guise of loyalty and care. The telegrams and the misdirected suspicions were all instruments to achieve this end. All eyes were now fixed on Mr. Aldridge. He stood rigid, pale, and caught between defiance and the dawning acknowledgement of inevitable exposure. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, compassionate in its firmness. The opportunity presented itself at the gathering in the study. A moment of carelessness, and the truth became apparent. That is why I requested your presence tonight, to unravel the knot in a way that neither frightens nor humiliates unduly. He swallowed hard, the weight of realization pressing on him, and then, in a voice almost choked, admitted, "Yes, it was me. I thought no one would notice the subtle signs." A hush enveloped the room, the villagers stunned into silence, while Miss Marple returned to her chair, picking up her knitting with deliberate calm. "You see," she concluded, "deception may appear seamless when viewed from a distance, but human nature, in all its quirks and inconsistencies, always leaves clues. Observing without judgment and listening without presumption, one can uncover the hidden truths, no matter how cleverly concealed." She glanced around at the relieved and chastened faces, a quiet satisfaction settling over the room. The local constable stepped forward, gently guiding Mr. Aldridge toward the door, the ordeal resolved. Outside, the village seemed unchanged, Yet something intangible had shifted. Justice had been served, and the peace of St. Mary Mead restored. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes briefly closing as a small, knowing smile crossed her face, the quiet triumph of insight mingling with the familiar, comforting rhythm of the village life continuing around her. And so, in the heart of the evening, the mystery of the deceptive telegrams, the intricate subterfuge, and the hidden ambitions was laid bare, leaving those present with a renewed appreciation for the subtle wisdom of a shrewd observer and the enduring truths that lie behind the most ordinary faces.